final rule. It's called pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. And it's the most personal chapter in the book. It's a lot about my daughter. And my daughter was very ill when she was a kid, but particularly when she was a teenager. She had a very terrible time of it. She had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and when she was between the ages of 14 and 16, it first destroyed her hip, which had to be replaced, and then it destroyed the ankle on her other leg, which had to be replaced. And she walked around for 2 years on broken legs, and she was taking massive doses of opiates and could hardly stay awake. And she had this advanced autoimmune disease, which produced all sorts of other symptoms that were just as bad as the joint degeneration, but which are harder to describe. And so it's just bloody brutal. And as a test of your faith, there's almost nothing that's more direct than a serious illness inflicted upon an innocent child, right? And so the chapter's a meditation on that, and also on, well, what to do in a situation like that, because everyone is going to have a situation like that in some sense, because you'll be faced with illness in the people that you love and in crisis. And so it's a practical guide to coping with those sorts of things. And one of the things you do when you're overwhelmed by crisis is you shorten your time frame. It's like you can't think about next month. Maybe you can't even bloody well think about next week, or maybe not even tomorrow. Because now is just so overwhelming that that's all there is. It's like, and that's what you do. You cut your time frame back until you can cope with it. And if it's not the next week that you see how to get through, then it's the next day. And if it's not the next day, then it's the next hour. And if it's not the next hour, then it's the next minute. And people are very, 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 very tough. And it turns out that if you face things that you can put up with a lot more than you think you can put up with, and you can do it without becoming corrupted. And she did recover quite fully, and much as a consequence of her own machinations, because she figured out what was wrong with her and then took the necessary steps to fix it, which is nothing short of a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, part of the cat bit is, I actually start by talking about our dog, who actually died about a year ago, but he's still alive in the book. I let people know, because dog lovers love dogs, and if you love cats, then they think you don't like dogs, and then they think you don't like you. So I also point out at the beginning of the chapter that, if you want to pet a dog on the street, that's okay too, so you don't have to get up in arms about it. But the idea is that, you have to be alert when you're suffering. You have to be alert to the beauty in life, the unexpected beauty in life. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across with the idea of the cat. There's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat. And cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and she rolls over on his back, and Seiko used to, nose her a bit. And then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And, you have to look for that little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And, you narrow your time frame and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times, and maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. There's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough, but you can take that, terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, is this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist. And maybe we could make the world into a better place, And it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And
Hello, Dr. Peterson. I've been trying to listen to my conscience, but I can't tell the difference between fear, willful blindness, or genuine conscience. Well, the first thing I would say about that is it is quite clear that you are, in fact, trying to listen to your conscience, because that's probably the first thing that you discover. So that's a really good question. Okay. fear? Well, here's a test, and you don't want to do this stupidly. If you think that you should do something, and you think that the reason you might not be doing it is because you're afraid, then you should do it. So that way you can find out if it's fear. I think your question is, well, how do I know my conscience isn't just masquerading as fear, saying, well, you shouldn't do that, but it's rationalizing the real issue, which is you're afraid of doing that. Now, see, here's a reason that you want to tell the truth. And I kind of figured this out when I was looking deeply into the Pinocchio story. In Pinocchio, as Pinocchio strives to become real, he has a conscience to guide him, but it's Jiminy Cricket, this insect. But Jiminy isn't really a very good conscience. He's a bit dogmatic to begin with, dogmatic and inexperienced. And so it's not like the conscience is an unerring guide. It's like a partner in discovery. And as you move forward in your life and you consult your conscience and you listen to it, then it gets smarter, and so do you. But there's a coda there, and this is why I've suggested, part of the reason why I've suggested so frequently in my lectures and in my book, that people try not to lie. You see, there are many systems. You have many systems within, let's say, that guide you. And one of those is your capacity for rational thought. And then you have a variety of emotional systems and motivational systems and internal dramas and intuitions and bodily sensations, like lots and lots of, and senses, lots of systems that are guiding you. And many of them operate, you might say, unconsciously, autonomously, instinctively, implicitly, all of that. Now, nonetheless, you program them, like you feed them content, let's say. Just like you feed your body nourishment, you feed them content. And a lot of the content that you feed them pertains directly to your voluntary thoughts and speech and your actions. And then if you pathologize those by lying, so if you say things that you know not to be true, or you don't say things that you know to be true when you need to, which is more common, and if you act in ways that you consider reprehensible, then you pathologize all of those autonomous systems that guide you. It's like you're programming them badly. You're building an AI system inside yourself, really, and in some sense that is what you're doing, that has very bad training data. And so the output it produces won't guide you properly. And so you don't want to pathologize your guidance systems. It's a really bad idea. So that's why you have to not lie. And maybe that's also why you have to say what you have to say. And you have to say it clearly as well. And you have to learn how to do that. So that's one of the ways of getting your conscience straightened out. And then you have to have a dialogue with your conscience. And you might ask, it's like, okay, well, what should I do? Or what should I do this, or should I not do this? So let's say you're thinking, should I not do this in the case of a temptation? Maybe you have a chance to develop a new relationship, and you're excited about it and apprehensive about it and afraid of it, and you don't know how to sort out all those feelings. And the first thing is you really have to want to sort them out. That's why you have to orient yourself to something that's a genuine up, the star above the horizon. You have to really want things to be straight, and you have to have thought that through, and you have to know what it means for things not to be straight. And really what it means is that you're headed for hell in one way or another. And if you understand that, maybe it's enough to scare you straight. You really got to think that through. Then you got to think about how much better it would be if you aimed up. And that really has to kind of permeate your whole being. And so then you're oriented that way. You're oriented up, and you're deciding that it's okay to try to tell the truth. And then you can start to rely on this dialogue with your conscience. But both of you have to learn, and you're going to make mistakes along the way. That's okay. You can say, well, I'm going to try this without being certain that it's right. You can even say, I'm going to say this without being certain that it's correct. Like if you're arguing with your wife or your husband or your sister or your father, and you have an idea about what might be going on, you can say, look, here's my idea about what's going on. Who knows what that idea might be contaminated with? Like maybe I'm putting it forward just because I'm too proud or arrogant or angry or fearful or whatever. That's possible. Let's see if we can figure that out. But you can offer it tentatively and both have at it. That's what you do if it's a hypothesis, right? You both have at it and see if it's an idea that's worthy of keeping. You do that with your conscience. And then you move forward. There's a technique in behavioral psychology called psychotherapy called collaborative empiricism. So let's say that you and I have been sitting down and we decide that you're going to try something new this week. Like maybe you're agoraphobic and you're having a hard time in a parking lot. And so getting out of the car and going to the grocery store. So maybe we say, well, you're going to drive to the grocery store and you're just going to walk halfway halfway from your car to the door. And that's good enough for, like, do that every second day for a week. And then come back and let's talk about it. So that's collaborative empiricism. You're running a little experiment. So you think, well, your conscience is guiding you towards something. You take a tentative step in that direction. And then you check and see, well, did what I wanted to have happen occur as an outcome? That's the crucial question. And that's the crucial question for behavioral truth, right? That's the pragmatic perspective. Did what I want to have happen as a consequence of my framework of interpretation and my action? If the answer is yes, then I have not invalidated it, right? That's the pragmatic philosophy in a nutshell, and it's very, very smart. So you have a dialogue with your conscience that never ends, and hopefully it gets wiser, and you get wiser. And that's the dialogue that Jung talked about between the conscious and the unconscious, between your fantasy life, say, the life that's sort of underneath you as a conscious being, like the life that's part of your biological platform, the biological platform that somehow miraculously gives rise to your consciousness. You have a dialogue with that. We're always in dialogue. We're always in dialogue, right, with everything. So pursue that.
People who are cynical about religious structures like to think of faith as the willingness to demolish your intellect in the service of superstition. And there's something to be said for that perspective, but not a lot, because the reality is much more sophisticated. Part of the faith that is being insisted upon in the Old Testament is something like, and I'm speaking psychologically here again, that it's useful to posit a high good and to aim at it. So, and I really think that's practically useful too. The research we've done with the Future Authoring Program, for example, indicates pretty clearly that if you get people to conceptualize an ideal, and a balanced ideal, so what do you want for your family? What do you want for your career? What do you want for your education? What do you want for your character development? How are you going to use your time outside of work? How are you going to structure your use of drugs and alcohol in places where you might get impulsive? How can you avoid falling into a horrible pit? If you really think that through and you come up with an integrated ideal and you put it above you as something to reach for, then you're more committed to the world in a positive way, and you're less tormented by anxiety and uncertainty. And that makes sense, right? Because here you are alive and everything. And so, unless you were if you're not capable of manifesting some positive relationship with the fact of your being, then how could that be anything other than hellish? Because it would just be anxiety provoking and terrible because you're vulnerable and there'd be nothing useful or worthwhile to do. Well, that's just not, I just can't see that as a winning strategy for anyone. You can make a rational case for adopting that strategy in that, you can say, well, there's no evidence for a transcendent morality or for an ultimate meaning. There's no hard empirical evidence. But it seems to me that there's existential evidence as well that has to be taken into account. And of course, psychologists have talked about this a lot. Carl Rogers, for example, and Jung, for that matter, Freud, for that matter, most of the great psychologists have pointed out that, you can derive reasonable information that's solid from your own experience, especially if you also talk to other people, and you can kind of see in your own life when you're on a productive path that sort of ennobles and enlightens you, or a destructive path. And I think it's kind of useful to think that maybe the dichotomy between those two paths might be real, you know, and because that also allows you to give credence to your intuitions about that sort of thing. But I don't, anyways, I don't think it's unreasonable to posit that since you're alive, adopting the highest possible regard for the fact that you're alive and that you're surrounded by other creatures that are alive, I just can't see how that can possibly be construed as a losing strategy. And so that's the first thing. So that's something like faith, right? It's faith. It's not only faith in your being, but it's faith in being as such. And the faith would be something like, if you could orient your being properly, then maybe that would orient you with being as such. And you never know. Like, I mean, it might be true. There's no reason to assume that it wouldn't be true. I mean, even if you just take a strict biological perspective on this and think about us as the product of 3.5 billion years of evolution, I mean, we have struggled over all those billions of years to be alive and to match ourselves with reality. And so, because one of the things I've often wondered is, you know, life is definitely difficult. There's no doubt about that. And it's unfair and there's inequality and all of those things. And people are subject to all sorts of terrible things. But I also wonder, if you weren't actively striving to make things worse, just how much better could they be? You know, because people are they're like houses that are divided amongst themselves. They're pointing in 6 different directions at the same time. They're working at cross purposes to themselves because of bitterness and resentment and unprocessed memories and childhood hatreds and unexamined assumptions, all sorts of things. And you just got to wonder if you could push that aside and orient yourself properly. And then the other thing that, of course, is stressed very heavily in the Old Testament, and of course that goes through the entire biblical corpus, is that it's not only enough to establish a positive relationship with being, which I think is the essential, it's a good description of faith. You have to make that decision, right? Because being is very ambivalent. And you can make the case that maybe it's something that should have never happened. But that doesn't seem to be productive to me. And faith seems to be, I'm going to act as if being is ultimately justifiable, and that if I partake in it properly, I will improve it rather than making it worse. So I think that's the statement of faith. And then what seems to go along with that is something like truth in conception and action. You know, even people like Jacob, who are pretty damn morally ambivalent to begin with, get hammered a lot by what they go through. And what seems to happen is that they're hammered into some sort of ethical shape, right? So by the midpoint of their life's journey, there's people who are solidly planted, who you can trust and who don't betray being or themselves or their fellow man. And so it's an interesting, I mean, it seems reasonable to me to first assume that you have to establish a relationship with something that's transcendent. It might even be just the future version of you. And then second, that you have to align yourself with reality in a truthful manner, and that that's your best bet. And the biblical stories are actually quite realistic about that too, because they don't really say that if you do that, you're going to be instantly transported to the promised land. Like even Moses, as we'll find out in the Exodus stories, he never makes it to the promised land. And so it's not like you're offered instantaneous final redemption if you move out forthrightly into the world, establish a faithful relationship with being, and attempt to conduct yourself with integrity. But it's your best bet, and it might be good enough. And even if it's not good enough, it's really preferable to the alternative, which seems to be something closely akin to hell, both personal and social.
And the Midianites sold Joseph into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. So now he's a slave. So now you'd think, well, this is a man who has a lot of reason to be irritated at the structure of reality, right? He's gone from being the favorite to being betrayed by all of his brothers. That's pretty rough. And then he's being transformed into a slave, and now he's being
He's being sold to work as a slave. So you'd think that that would corrupt his character. Because you know, one of the things, I think this is the case anyways, I think people are always looking for an excuse to have their character corrupted. Because if your character is corrupted, then you get to lie, and you get to cheat, and you get to steal, and you get to betray, and you get to act resentfully, and you get to do nothing, and that's all easy. It's easier to lie than to tell the truth. It's easier to do nothing than to do something. So there's always part of you thinking, well, I need a justification for being useless and horrible, because that'd be a lot less work. And so then if something terrible comes along, you think, aha, that's just exactly the excuse that I was waiting for. And then out all that comes. You know, Solzhenitsyn, when he was in the concentration camps in Russia, watching how people behaved, you know, he said that there were people that were put in the camps who immediately became trustees or guards, and they were even more vicious than the people who had been hired as guards. And his idea was that they had collected all that, he called it foulness, if I remember correctly, around them in normal life. But they didn't have the opportunity to express it. But as soon as you gave them the opportunity, it was like, there it was, right away. And so one of the messages that seems to echo through these Old Testament stories is that just because something terrible happens to you doesn't mean that you get to wander off the path and make things worse. And maybe it doesn't matter how terrible it is that what happens to you. And that's a tough call, you know, because you see people now and then in life who they've really got it rough, man. Like 50 bad things are happening to them at the same time, and you think, oh, it's no wonder. If you were bitter and resentful and hostile, it'd be like, yeah, no wonder. But then you meet people, and Solzhenitsyn again talked about this in the Gulag Archipelago. He said he met lots of people in the, not lots, he met enough people to impress him in the concentration camp system who didn't allow their misfortunes to corrupt them. And that's something, man. Because maybe the only real misfortune is to become corrupted. That's a really useful thing to think. You know, maybe the rest of it is trivial in comparison. I know that's a rough thing because you can be in very harsh circumstances, but I do think there's something to that. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So that's an echo of the idea that we encountered earlier about walking with God, right? So Adam walked with God before he ate the fruit with Eve, and then he wouldn't walk with God. And then Noah walked with God, and Abraham walked with God. And so the idea is, well, that's that alignment with the highest ideal. I think it's something like that. And you know, we could think about that as a metaphysical claim as well. But I don't think it is. I mean, I've got thousands of letters now in the last year from people who have told me that they were in a pit. That's exactly right. And that they decided that they were going to try to put their lives together. And that it worked. And so that's really something, you know, and they write surprised. It's like, well, I decided that I was going to work hard at what I was doing, and I wasn't going to lie any more than absolutely necessary. I thought I'd give it a try for a few months, you know. And all sorts of good things started to happen to me. It's like, maybe that's how the world works. Now, obviously, it doesn't work like that all the time, right? Because you can get sliced off at the knees. I mean, there's an arbitrary element to existence that you can't wish away. But that doesn't mean that there aren't bad strategies and good strategies. And so I do think that one of the most fundamental existential questions is, like, if things aren't going well for you in your life, is, are you absolutely certain that you're doing absolutely everything you can to put things in order? Because if you're not, then you shouldn't complain, because you don't know to what degree you're actually contributing or even causing the circumstance. Now, that's a very annoying thing to think, and I'm not trying to blame the victim. You know, I know that people end up with lung cancer because they were exposed to asbestos, you know. I'm not trying to, although I also know too that if you have lung cancer because you've been exposed to asbestos, that can be a tragedy or it can be hell, and to some degree that depends on how you conduct yourself.